are these people?
In the same vein, we're going to talk about the economics going on in Syria right now. We tend to follow the money here on this show. It usually leads us to good advice. Between that and assuming your government is lying to you, we're doing pretty well. But anyway, another MintPress article, this time Kit Klarenberg. Welcome, Kit Klarenberg, frequent, person on this show. So he writes, Privatizing Syria, U.S. plans to sell off a nation's wealth after Assad. So another indie media award honoree, doing the business. So in the immediate wake of the Syrian government's abrupt collapse, much remains uncertain about the country's future, including whether it can survive as a unitary state or will splinter into smaller states as did Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. A move that ultimately led to a bloody NATO intervention. Moreover, who or what may take power in Damascus remains an open question. For the time being, at least, members of the ultra-extremist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham appear highly likely to take key positions whenever administrative structure spouts from Bashar Assad's ouster after a decade and a half of grinding Western-sponsored regime change efforts. As Reuters reported on December 12th, ATS is already stamping its authority on Syria's state with the same lightning speed that it seized the country, deploying police, installing an interim government, and meeting foreign envoys. Meanwhile, its bureaucrats, who until last week were running on Islamist administration in a remote corner of Syria's northwest, have moved en masse into government headquarters in Damascus. Mohammed Bashir, head of HTS regional government in extremist-occupied Idlib, has been appointed the country's caretaker prime minister. However, despite the chaos and precariousness of post-Assad Syria, one thing seems assured. The country will be broken upon to Western economic exploitation at long last. That's what this is mainly about, I'm sure. Multiple reports show that HTS has informed local and international businesses leaders that when in office, it will, quote, adopt a free market model and integrate the country into the global economy in a major shift from decades of corrupt state control. That means what?
Capitalism.
That.
Yeah, means Libya.
That too. Lebanon, As Alexander McKay of the Marx Engels Lenin Institute tells MintPress News, state-controlled parts of Syria's economy may have been under Assad, but corrupt it wasn't. He believes a striking feature of the ongoing attacks on Syrian infrastructure from forces within and without the country is that economic and industrial sites are a recurrent target. Moreover, the would-be HTS-dominated government has done nothing to counter these broadsides when securing key economic assets will be vital to societal reconstruction and therefore a matter of priority. So, we can see clearly what kind of country these moderate rebels plan to build. Forces like HTS are allied with U.S. imperialism, and their economic approach will reflect this. Prior to the proxy war, the government pursued an economic approach that mixed public ownership and market elements. State intervention enabled a degree of political independence that other nations in the regions lack. Assad's administration understood without an industrial base, being sovereign is impossible. The new free market approach will see all of that utterly decimated. So, yeah. Syria's economic independence and strength under Assad's rule and the benefits reaped by average citizens as a result were never acknowledged in the mainstream before or during the decade-long proxy war. Yet, countless reports from major international institutions underline this reality, which has now been brutally vanquished, never to return. We'll see about the never part. For example, in April 2015, the WHO document noted how Damascus had one of the best developed healthcare systems in the Arab world.
It's funny you mention that because I feel like I remember Richie Medhurst talking about this or similar stuff to this. It's just, and I know we've had Eva and Vanessa have said
both say this exact kind of stuff. Yep.
Same thing.
So,
And I think that's just kind of like the idea of the Arab world being backwards. I think that's just kind of the mentality that people in the West, and like as and I said to, well, Vanessa and Eva directly, maybe to Richie, possibly, but like
Yeah.
having been to the region myself, being in Jordan and Morocco, mind you, but still in the Arab world, like to me, it couldn't be farther from the truth. Like
Right.
as I've said many times, they are the most, at least in those two experiences, the
Hospitable.
most. Mhm.
I was watching
And
a thing with, and this is just a broader thing with, I think, people who follow Islam too, right? There's this
right.
stigma of them around the world. Was watching a podcast recently with the Dagestanis where a guy was like, "Well, I'll go over and train with you. We'll bring the wife. We'll leave the kids at home." And he was like, "No, no, 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 brother, bring kids.
Yes.
like,
Yeah. Yeah.
we'll handle it." Like,
Right.
which is,
And I take it personally, given Islam, because my younger sister and her husband are like but
right.
Muslim.
Yeah.
So, so like, and you got to remember, folks, like Islam is a religion. That means it goes across all ethnic groups. So it's not just all Arabs that are
Yes.
like Muslim, and even them may not all be Muslim either. Like, like people forget that there are such things as Black Muslim or white Muslims, or whatever ethnic group you can
Jamaican
think of.
Muslims.
So, right. So the idea that like you're kind of like, it's almost like the stereotypical idea of like a Muslim is someone with a turban, and even in that, it's kind of like a stereotype because you might be more thinking of someone who is chic more often than not. But yeah, but it's just the idea of the world, that side of the world is backwards, and especially like with a lot of Zionists are like, oh, we're coming in and bringing in all tech and all that kind of like. First of all, fuck off, because that, even if that is kind of like a classist viewpoint, but it's also like, you're devaluing the very things that the Arab world has given us, like in a way of how we think about science and math, like has come, especially in the West, has come from the Arab world. So,
Yep.
So yeah, so it's just, and I think that's on purpose, given the media that we don't see a lot about the Middle East, or when we do, it's often like bomb, 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 bombs, like
Over Baghdad.
whereas like. Right. But whereas, having been there, as you said, they're extremely hospitable. They're willing to do anything for you, even if asked, and will go out their way. And again, I can only speak anecdotally, but given that Vanessa and Eva were able, and they lived there, being able to kind of share that sentiment, as foreigners living among them, I can vouch for them in saying that. And like, quality of life, honestly, like, is good. Like, not to say that there aren't any issues. In any country, you're going to see that. But, like.
Meanwhile, at the Hall of Justice.
So, in the Halls of Justice, 2018, they give you universal health care was extended to all Syrian citizens, right? Who enjoy the highest levels of care in the region. Education was likewise free. And before the conflict, an estimated 97% of primary school age Syrian children were attending class, and Syria's literacy rates were thought to be at over 90% for both men and women.
Emphasis added on the women, for those of you who might be listening, because it's still the idea of like, women don't get shit, women like have no rights. And again, not to say it's perfect, but women are educated. So,
yep. By 2016, millions were out of school. So, right. Good for them. A UN Human Rights Council report 2 years later noted pre-war Syria was the only country in the Middle East region to be self-sufficient in food production. Its thriving agricultural center contributing about 21% to GDP from 2006 to 2011. Civilians' daily calorie intake was on par with many Western countries, with prices kept affordable via state subsidy. Meanwhile, the country's economy
may not necessarily be a good thing.
Well, no, state subsidy of growing the food, like
right,
as opposed to the other way around of subsidizing the bottom.
Yeah,
I
guess I kind of thought about it like, oh, you eat too much, but like especially here, we tend to eat way more than what we need. But
yeah, I'll wait till the gout epidemic starts before I'm like, they're getting too many calories, But meanwhile, the country's economy was one of the best performing in the region, with a growth rate averaging 4.6 annually. At the time that report was written, Damascus had been reduced to heavy reliance on imports by Western sanctions in many sectors, and even then was barely able to buy or sell much in the way of anything, as the measures amounted to an effective embargo. Simultaneously, the U.S. military occupation of a resource-rich third of Syria cut off the government's access to its own oil reserves and wheat. The situation would only worsen with the Caesar Syrian Civilian Protection Acts passing in June 2020. Under its auspices, a vast volume of goods and services in every conceivable field were and today remained banned from being sold to or traded with any Syrian citizen or entity. The legislative's termed explicit state preventing attempts to rebuild Syria was its chief objective. One passage openly outlines a strategy to deter foreign persons from entering into contracts related to reconstruction specifically. So, immediately after coming into effect, the Syrian pound's value collapsed further, sending living costs skyrocketing. In a blink, almost the entire country's population was left barely able to afford even the bare essentials. Even mainstream sources, typically approving of belligerence toward Damascus, cautioned of an inevitability impending humanitarian crisis. However, Washington was neither concerned nor deterred by such warnings. James Jeffrey, State Department Chief of Syria Policy, actively cheered these developments. As they do, simultaneously, as Jeffrey subsequently admitted to a PBS, the U.S. was engaged in frequent secret communications with HTS and actively assisting the group, albeit indirectly due to the faction's designation as a terrorist entity by the State Department. This followed direct approaches to Washington by its leaders, including Abu Muhammad Jabroni, leader of Al-Qaeda affiliate Al-Nusra. "We want to be your friend. We're not terrorists. We're just fighting Assad," HTS reportedly said. Given this contact, it may be no coincidence that in July 2022, Jelani issued a series of communications about HTS's plans for future Syria, containing multiple passages in which finance and industry loomed large, directly foreshadowing the group's recent pledge to adopt a free market model. The extremist mass murderer discussed his desire to open up local markets to the global economy. Many passages read as if they were authored by representatives of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, for those wondering. Coincidentally, Syria since 1984 has refused IMF loans, a key tool by which the U.S. empire maintains the global capitalist system and dominates the global south, ensuring poor countries remain under its heel. The World Trade Organization, of which Damascus isn't a member either, plays a similar role. Ascension to both would go some way to cementing the free market model advocated by HTS after over a decade of deliberate, systemic economic ruin, geopolitical risk analysis, Faraz Modad tells MintPress they have no choice. They need Turkish and Qatari backing, so they will need to liberalize. They have no capital whatsoever. The country is in ruins, and they desperately need investment. Plus, they hope liberalizing may attract some Saudi, Emirati, or Egyptian interest. It is impossible for Syria to rebuild using its own resources. The civil war might resume. They are acting out of necessity. So, in Syria's protracted political and economic dismantling, there are eerie echoes of the U.S. empire's destruction of Yugoslavia throughout the 1990s. During that decade, the multi-ethnic socialist federation's breakup produced bitter wars of independence in Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia, encouraged, financed, armed, and prolonged every step by Western powers. Belgrade's perceived centrality to those brutal conflicts and purported complicity in and sponsorship of horrendous war crimes led the U.S. Security Council to impose sanctions against what remained on the country in May 1992. The measures were the harshest ever levied in UN history, at one point producing inflation of 5.578 quintillion %. Drug abuse, alcoholism, preventable deaths, and suicide skyrocketed, while shortages of goods, including water, were perpetual. Where does this sound like?
Now?
Yeah.
Now?
In a few specific places. Yep. And everywhere. But Yugoslavia's once thriving independent industry was crippled. Its ability to manufacture even everyday medicines virtually non-existent. By February 1993, the CIA asserted that the average citizen had become accustomed to periodical shortages, long lines in stores, cold homes in the winter, and restrictions on electricity, just like they talk about in Palestine. So, surviving the wreckage, years later, Foreign Affairs noted that sanctions against Yugoslavia demonstrated how, in a matter of months or years, whole economies can be devastated, and such measures can serve as unequally lethal weapons of mass destruction against civilian populations of target countries. Yet, despite such desolation and misery, throughout this period, Belgrade remained resistant to privatization and foreign ownership of its industry, or to the pillaging of its vast resources. The overwhelming majority of Yugoslavia's economy was state or worker-owned. Yugoslavia was not a member of the IMF, World Bank, or World Trade Organization, which went some way to insulate the country from economic predation. In 1998, though authorities began wagging a heavy-handed counterinsurgency against the Kosovo Liberation Army, a CIA and MI6-funded and armed al-Qaeda-linked extremist militia, this provided the U.S. empire with a pretext to, at last, finish the job of neutralizing what remained of the country's socialist system. As a Clinton administration official later admitted, it was Yugoslavia's resistance to the broader trends of political and economic reform in Eastern Europe, not the plight of Kosovar Albanians, that best explains NATO's war. I mean, just change all the names and countries, and it's like 9 things we talk about, you know? So, but from March-June 1999, the military alliance bombed Yugoslavia for 78 straight days, yet Belgrade's army was barely in the firing line at any stage. In all, officially just 14 Yugoslav tanks were destroyed by NATO, but 372 separate industrial facilities got smashed to smithereens, leaving hundreds of thousands jobless. Markedly, the alliance took guidance from U.S. corporations on which sites to target, and not a single foreign or privately owned factory. Funny how that works, you know? NATO's bombing laid the foundations for Yugoslav's leader Slobodan Milosevic's removal via a CIA and National Endowment for Democracy sponsored color revolution in October of the following year. In his place, a doggedly pro-Western government advised by a collective of U.S.-sponsored economists took power. Their explicit mission was to make an economic environment favorable for private and other investment in Belgrade. Ravaging shock therapy measures were deployed the moment they assumed office, to the further detriment of an already eviscerated and impoverished population. In the decades since, successive Western-backed governments across the former Yugoslavia has enforced an endless array of neoliberal reforms to ensure an investor-friendly environment locally for wealthy Western oligarchs and corporations. In lockstep, low wages and a lack of employment opportunities stubbornly endure or worsen while living costs rise, producing mass depopulation, among other destructive effects. All along, U.S. officials intimately implicated in the country's breakup have brazenly sought to enrich themselves from the privatization of former state industries. Sound familiar? You know?
Yes.
So, does such fate await Damascus? For Powell Worgan, political coordinator at the Progressive International, the answer is a resounding yes. He believes the country's story is familiar to those who study the mechanisms of imperialist expansion. Once its defenses are fully neutralized, he foresees the country's industries being brought up at bargain sale prices as part of market reforms, which transfer yet another chunk of humanity's wealth to Western corporations. We've witnessed the well-rehearsed choreography of imperialist regime change. A tyrant is overthrown, backers of national sovereignty are systematically and viciously repressed, with tremendous but hidden violence. The country's assets are chopped and diced and sold to the lowest bidder. Labor protections are discarded. Human lives are cut short. The most predatory form of capitalism take root in every crevice and pore that emerges in the collapse of the state. This is the agenda of structural adjustment policies endorsed by the World Bank and IMF, which I know you've talked about the IMF a ton. So Alexander McKay echoes Worgan's analysis. Now, free Syria will be forcibly made dependent upon imports from the West evermore. This not only fattens the empire's bottom line, but also severely restricts the freedom of any Syrian government to act with any degree of independence. He notes that similar efforts have been undertaken throughout the post-1989 era of U.S. unipolarity. It was well underway in Russia during the 1990s until the slow turnaround in policy started in the early 2000s under Putin. The aim is to reduce Syria to the same status as Lebanon, with an economy controlled by imperial forces, an army used primarily for internal repression, and an economy no longer able to produce anything but merely serve as a market for commodities produced elsewhere and site of resource extraction. The U.S. and its allies do not want independent development of any nation's economy. We must hope the Syrian people can resist its latest act of neo-colonialism. So, closing thoughts?
You should probably put this on the soundboard. Tale as old as time. That's like you probably should. But it just reminds me when I first knew of who Richie Redhurst was, and like there was always just kind of like whenever he talked about Syria, like given that he is Syrian, like anger and also sadness.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of how the West has infiltrated his home. And I think this article just gives a very crystal clear picture as to how that's going to happen. It just also and I think, again, like everything is connected. It just goes back, you know, thinking in history, like the Berlin Conference, you know, all these European countries chopping up Africa to whatever resources that they wanted, to the exploitation of the people there. And look what has happened now. Like, you know, it's like, I have to wonder, is this why we don't really learn world history, like, at all in schools? Because now, granted, like,
the revolution will not be televised.
I've said this before, like when I loved world history, like when I was I hated American history with a passion, but I loved world history because I was able to see how connected everything was and how things kind of play together. Like, but even like in my classes, I wouldn't necessarily gone into stuff like this though. Especially given like in the Middle East. But it just goes to show you how little we know about our own world. And in a lot of ways, we know little about each other in terms of we see our oppression as unique to what's happening here. No, it's not. Like, again, I was in Canada a couple weeks ago. I said this to you offline, but I talked to a guy who I guess his family's from Greece. And he said something that was very kind of shocking to me. Not to me, but I think in the way he said it just randomly, given that he met me just maybe like half an hour before. But basically he was like, you know what? Toronto is sold out. I said, what do you mean by that? Because he's like many years ago, like Toronto was like a city with like actual neighborhoods and like I talked about at the beginning of the show, like how there was a little Italy, which still exists, but there's like a Chinatown and a Greek town and like a Polish town and like all these little enclaves of little neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods that were very apparent in Toronto. And then like as gentrification will do, like took that over, increased housing, built all these high rises, which didn't exist in Toronto up until maybe within the last 30 years or so. Prices have gone up, so now people are living out, and like all these mom and pop businesses, you know, like that were like a key in Toronto's economy are no longer exist, or they're very few of them. And you know, then he kind of turned around. He said, you know, like, I'm not sure if I should have said that to you because I hope you will come back. But I mean, you know, just given that we do this as far as the podcast and we kind of talk about this as far on the international scale, it's like, no, this makes perfect sense to me, you know? And like, we think of Canada as like, not always, but I think we think of Canada as like, almost like paradise in a sense. Yeah, they have universal healthcare and all that kind of stuff, but they deal with the same issues generally that we do. So point being, our struggle is not unique in of ourselves. It's everywhere. But at the hand of imperialists and the elites who want to steal our resources for their benefit to the exploitation of everybody else. And that's why I think we need to have more, you know, solidarity, not just among ourselves, but worldwide in terms of the issues that we all connect with to be able to fight against it. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if people have that focus anymore. Like, I think people are tired. I think people are just tuned out and would rather be entertained than to really deal with the issues head on and actually try to think of ways that we can actually come back against it. And I get it. It's such a big monster.
Yeah.
Like, I get it. Like, it's overwhelming. But
I mean, I also feel like most good teachers, entertaining is part of it. But you know,
but there's a way to do both. I mean,
yes,
you can entertain to bring them in, but that shouldn't be the thing to keep people there.
They still got to do their own homework, you know.
Right.
So,
and yeah, we need to unplug and be entertained every once in a while, but the work still needs to be done. Mm-hmm. And if none of us are doing it, then what work is being done? So,
yep.
Yeah, but yeah, it's just very sad. But it just gives me a lot more perspective of what Richie was saying, like in his live streams many years ago, that at the time I was just kind of like, not to say I didn't get it, but I didn't have the context to it, even though he shared it. But yeah, this article just kind of was like brought me back to 2020, and just him going off on
time.
Yeah, so
no, what? Sorry. Singing songs like that is probably why we're demonetized. So you can go to podashfeed.com/indienewsnetwork. Disney, don't take my kneecaps, please. I need them. But yeah, scan that QR code. Links are in the chat description below. If you're in the chat, you can put exclamation mark donate. Get a little link to go give us a super chat if you want. You know, but otherwise just like and subscribe. All the same stuff every other YouTube asks you to do. Does this even work? Does asking you to subscribe actually get you subscribed? Let us know in the comments whether it actually works. You know, supposedly it does. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, if you don't like us, leave a downvote. I don't care. Just engage. That's how the internet works now. But anyway, otherwise, thanks for watching.